Hello and welcome to OffBlueMedical. Today we're going to be discussing 5 never rules that you must memorize for the USMLE. So these case scenarios are the tricky ones that they bring up to mess your mind up and that you select the wrong answer choice. So what are they? The first rule is that you never give beta blockers for cocaine-induced chest pain. Okay, and this is really important. So the classic board question is going to be, for example, a 32 years old patient who comes into the ER. They are agitated with severe chest pain, they are diaphoretic, hyperventilating, their heart rate is 130, their blood pressure is 160 over 100, okay, and their urinary toxicology is positive for cocaine. And then you see an ECG, okay, and it may show new ST segment depression. So what your brain is going to think is that this is a sympathetic storm. I need to bring his heart rate and blood pressure fast. So let's give metoprolol, for example, a beta blocker, or propranolol. You should stop, you should not do it. This is a classic contraindication. Okay, so metoprolol is a wrong answer choice because cocaine is a potent sympathomimetic that it blocks the reuptake of norepinephrine and epinephrine and dopamine as well. So this is going to lead to epinephrine flooding the synaptic cleft, stimulating both alpha and beta receptors. So if I draw it, for example, here, okay, and this is going to be the neuron, and you see that this is, for example, the muscle, okay, then you're going to get a lot of epinephrine, for example, epinephrine, and then you have the alpha blockers and the beta blockers. And the epinephrine usually acts on the alpha blocker, or it acts on the beta blocker, and then it gets a reuptake, okay? But if we block this reuptake via cocaine, then the epinephrine is going to stay in this cleft and is going to act on the alpha receptors and the beta receptors. So if you introduce a pure beta blocker like, for example, metoprolol, you're going to block the beta 2 receptors. They normally mediate vasodilation. So with this beta pathway blocked, these circulating epinephrines, they are going to act entirely unopposed on the alpha receptors. This is going to cause what? When they act on the alpha receptors, is going to cause unopposed action on the alpha 1 receptors, and this is going to lead to an unopposed alpha adrenergic vasoconstriction. So the result is that it's going to you're going to get a catastrophic, life-threatening coronary artery vasospasm, a massive spike in blood pressure, and a full blown out myocardial infarction. So you have to remember that you should not pick metoprolol or propranolol. The next step in the management, or the correct step, is to give intravenous benzodiazepines such as lorazepam to reduce central sympathetic drive alongside nitroglycerine. So you're going to give benzodiazepines such as lorazepam to reduce this central sympathetic drive. The second case scenario is that you should never restrict dietary calcium in Crohn's disease with oxalate stones. Okay, so the examiners love this scenario because it exploits a false sense of logic. You're going to get a patient with a history of Crohn's disease, and they have maybe a previous ileal resection. They're going to present with acute flank pain. Okay, maybe it's a right-sided flank pain, and then your analysis is going to show what? It's going to show hematuria, the classic envelope-shaped oxalate kidney stones on microscopy, and you're going to diagnose what? You're going to diagnose it as calcium oxalate kidney stones. Since the stone is literally made of calcium oxalate, your intuitive gut reaction is to tell the patient, hey, cut down your calcium intake and avoid milk, cheese, etc. So if you choose that option on the exam, you get it wrong. Why? In a healthy intestine, dietary calcium binds directly to oxalate to form an insoluble complex that is safely excreted in the feces. Okay, so if I draw it right now, let's say this is the gut. Usually with oxalate, let's say there are 4 oxalate particles right here. In a healthy intestine, the calcium is going to bind to that. Okay, they are going to form an insoluble complex that is safely excreted in the feces. But in a patient with Crohn's disease or any ileal resection, there's going to be fat malabsorption because the bile acid pool is depleted. Okay, bile acids are usually going to be absorbed in the ileum. Okay, and these unabsorbed free fatty acids in the gut lumen, they are going to avidly bind to dietary calcium, and that's called calcium saponification, and this is going to leave oxalate completely free and unbound. So these oxalate particles are going to be unbound. So this free oxalate is highly soluble. Okay, it's going to enter the bloodstream, and it's going to travel to the kidneys, and it's going to precipitate with calcium, and that's going to form calcium oxalate stones. So if we restrict dietary calcium, we're going to leave even more oxalate particles in the GIT system that are unbound, and they're going to travel to the blood, and then they are going to travel to the kidney, and this is going to lead to calcium oxalate stones. So what's going to be the next step in management is going to be to increase oral calcium intake with meals, so it's going to bind the oxalate in the gut, and it can be safely excreted in the feces. The third rule is that you should never aspirate a hydatid cyst. So, for example, in the real exam, you might get a CT scan of a liver showing a round cyst with what's most important is the eggshell calcification along the border. Okay, so you're going to never perform diagnostic needle aspiration on a suspected hydatid cyst. I should imagine this scenario where an immigrant or a sheep farmer who has a close dog contact presents with a large fluid-filled cyst in the liver showing eggshell calcifications on CT. Okay, this is going to be the classic presentation of a hydatid cyst caused by the tapeworm Echinococcus granulosus. The question is going to ask for the next step in management. You're going to see maybe, for example, in one of the options, a percutaneous needle aspiration or a CT-guided cyst biopsy as an option. It sounds reasonable because we're always going to biopsy masses to confirm a diagnosis, right? Well, no, you should never do this. So you have to know that the fluid inside of a hydatid cyst is highly antigenic. If you insert a needle to aspirate or biopsy the cyst, you're going to run an extremely high risk of spilling or leaking of this fluid into the peritoneal cavity. And if it leaks, then you're going to cause what? You're going to cause an anaphylactic shock. Furthermore, also, when you spill this fluid, it's going to release the microscopic larval scoliosis. So you're going to infect the whole abdomen. It's going to erupt through the abdomen, and you're going to get even more cysts. So you should never do this. The next step in management is that you should treat it with albendazole and combined with surgical resection. And this is called the PAIR technique, which is puncture, aspiration, injection of hypertonic saline. Okay, not normal saline, but hypertonic saline. And then you're going to re-aspirate, but only under highly controlled conditions. The other rule is ceftriaxone in neonates, and you should never use this. Okay, is that you should never use ceftriaxone as any empiric therapy for meningitis or sepsis in a neonate. So let's say that there is a 2 weeks old infant, okay, that's presented with fever, irritability, and signs of a neonatal meningitis, okay, or for example, bulging fontanelle. You're going to suspect neonatal sepsis and meningitis. So you're going to do a lumbar puncture, and you need to start antibiotics. So in older children and adults, the standard gold standard treatment for that is going to be vancomycin plus ceftriaxone. But here you have to know that if the patient is under 30 days old, choosing ceftriaxone is a mistake. Why? Because if you do that, it's going to displace bilirubin from its binding sites on albumin. And if you displace bilirubin a lot from the binding sites on albumin, you're going to get an increased level of bilirubin. And if you get an increased level of bilirubin, then you're going to get jaundice, and you risk kernicterus, which is you're going to get deposits, okay, of bilirubin into the basal ganglia and the brain and the brainstem nuclei. You're going to cause irreversible brain damage. Other than this as well, it's kind of low yield, but you have to know that ceftriaxone, it can cause biliary sludging in neonates. So the correct step is that you should do cefotaxime instead of ceftriaxone in patients under 30 years old. Okay, and you should also combine it with ampicillin to cover bacteria such as Listeria monocytogenes. The final rule for this video is that you should never use daptomycin for pneumonia, especially for MRSA pneumonia, okay, for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So this is a classic mechanism of action trap. Okay, it could even come up on step 1. That is going to rely on the drug mechanism of action so that you could get it correctly. So the scenario would be a patient which is hospitalized with severe MRSA bacteremia is found to have concurrent lobar pneumonia. Okay, let's say we took sputum cultures and it grew MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and the chest X-ray confirmed a new lobar consolidation, and it says what's the next step in management. You might select daptomycin because it's a heavy-hitting bactericidal drug with excellent activity against MRSA. It seems like the perfect choice, right? But you should never do this. Okay. The reason for that, it's purely biochemical. Daptomycin's unique mechanism of action requires it to bind to bacterial cell membranes in a calcium-dependent matter. So it could be a little complex to understand this. Okay, you have to remember one thing, is that our lungs are lined with pulmonary surfactant. Okay, and this surfactant physically binds to daptomycin and it inactivates the drug before it can even reach the bacterial cell walls. Okay? So giving daptomycin for pneumonia is clinically equivalent to just giving water. So it's going to remain not cured, the infection, and it's going to worsen. It can lead to empyema, sepsis, or death. So the correct step in management here is that you should use vancomycin or linezolid for MRSA pneumonia.